The morning sun had barely crested the red ridge when Grant Archer rode his horse up the dirt path toward the Mercer homestead, the eviction notice folded crisp and official in the breast pocket of his vest, right next to his marshal's badge. He had not wanted this job. He had told himself that 3 times over breakfast, and each time the words had tasted like copper in his mouth. But the law was the law, and in Dustfall, Texas, in the spring of 1882, the law was the thing that separated civilization from chaos. What he had not expected, not in any version of this morning that he had imagined, was the woman standing on the porch with a rifle leveled at his chest. She was not trembling. That was the first thing Grant noticed. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, her jaw was set like iron, and her brown eyes did not waver from his face. She wore a simple cotton dress the color of dusty sage, and her boots were planted wide on the worn planks of the porch as though she had grown up from the earth itself and dared anyone to try to uproot her. "You can stop right there," she said, and her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had already decided exactly how this morning was going to go. Grant pulled his horse to a halt about 30 feet from the porch. He kept his hands visible away from the gun on his hip because he was not a fool and he could see that the woman knew how to hold that rifle. "Maria Mercer," he said. "Who's asking?" "Grant Archer, United States Marshal out of the Dustfall office." He reached slowly into his pocket, the breast pocket, and produced the folded document. "I have papers here, official papers, from the county courthouse in Abilene." "I know what you have," she said, "and I know who sent you." Something in the way she said it, the bitterness underneath, the knowledge, the betrayal layered into every syllable made Grant go still. He had ridden out here expecting a grieving widow. Someone confused, maybe, or simply unaware of the legal situation. He had not expected this, whatever this was. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the law requires," "the law," she said, and the words came out like a blade, "requires you to look at a deed before you make a man hand it over, or a woman, as the case may be." She reached into the pocket of her dress without lowering the rifle, an impressive and slightly terrifying maneuver, and produced her own folded document. She held it out toward him. "Come take it, Marshal, if you dare." Grant stared at her. The morning wind moved between them, stirring the dust at his horse's feet and carrying the faint smell of juniper and dry earth. Somewhere behind the house, a rooster crowed with no sense of irony. He got down from his horse. It had been 3 months since Grant Archer came to Dustfall, and in those 3 months he had dealt with cattle rustlers, a train robbery, 2 bar fights that ended in broken bones, and one very unpleasant standoff with a man who had convinced himself the railroad owed him $14,000. He had thought he had seen most of what this part of Texas had to offer. He was beginning to understand that he had been wrong. He walked toward the porch slowly, hands still out at his sides, watching the rifle. She tracked him with it, but her finger was off the trigger, which he chose to interpret as a good sign. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. She was looking down at him now, and even at that angle there was nothing small about her. She had a kind of contained fire that reminded him of the way a banked coal looks still and cool on the surface and burns hot and deep underneath. "Take it," she said again, and pushed the document toward him. He took it. He unfolded it carefully. And then he stood there in the morning light and read every word of it twice, because the first time through he could not quite believe what he was seeing. It was a deed, properly recorded, with a county seal from Abilene dated November 14, 1879, clear and legal and signed by 2 witnesses and the county recorder himself, granting the full 160 acres of the Mercer homestead to one Maria Elena Mercer, born 1856, of Dustfall, Brewster County, Texas. She was not just living on the land. She owned it outright. Grant looked up from the document. She was watching him read, and there was something in her expression that was not quite triumph and not quite grief. It was something in between the face of a woman who had won a battle she should never have had to fight. "Who sent you here?" she said quietly. He folded the deed carefully and held it out to her. The eviction order was filed by a man named Silas Croft. He claims he purchased this property from my husband, she said. My late husband, except that my husband did not own this land to sell because this land was deeded to me directly by my father before he died, before Daniel ever arrived, and the deed was recorded before Daniel and I ever married. She took the document back, tucked it into her pocket. So you see the problem, Marshal Archer. Grant saw the problem. He saw several problems, actually, and they were stacking up fast. He had spent the morning riding out here to execute an eviction that was based entirely on a fraudulent transaction. Someone had filed that paperwork with the courthouse, knowing full well about the prior deed, which meant either there was a clerk in Abilene who had been paid to look the other way, or Silas Croft was gambling on the assumption that a widow woman in a remote stretch of southwest Texas would be too frightened or too uninformed to challenge him. He looked at Maria Mercer, at the rifle still braced against her shoulder, at the absolute refusal in her eyes, at the way she stood on that porch like the earth itself was backing her up, and he thought that Silas Croft had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Lower the rifle, please," he said. She studied him for a long moment. "Are you here to evict me?" "No," he said. "I'm here to figure out what's actually happening." Slowly, carefully, she lowered the rifle. The tension in her shoulders did not entirely leave, but something shifted. A millimeter of trust extended under duress. "You'd better come inside then," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He followed her in. The inside of the Mercer homestead was not what Grant had expected either, though he was starting to understand that expecting anything in Maria Mercer's vicinity was a poor strategy. The main room was neat and thoughtfully kept. There were books on a shelf near the window, real books, not just the Bible, though the Bible was there too, spine cracked from use. There was a hand-drawn map of the property pinned to the wall beside the fireplace, and beside it a framed letter in neat handwriting that Grant did not read, but could tell from the signature at the bottom was from someone named Eduardo Mercer. Her father, he guessed. She hung the rifle on 2 hooks beside the door and moved to the cast-iron stove with the ease of long practice, filling a pot from the water bucket and setting it to heat. Grant took off his hat and held it, feeling oddly formal and out of place in the interior of someone else's life. "How long ago did your husband die?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. 14 months ago, a fever. He was sick 3 weeks and then he was gone." She said it without ceremony, which told him less about grief and more about the kind of person she was, someone who had already done her grieving in private and was not interested in performing it for strangers. "He left debts. I knew about some of them, not all. I paid what I could." She took 2 tin mugs from a shelf and set them on the table. "The debts I could not pay are what Silas Croft used to construct his claim. He bought them up, the unpaid notes, and then he filed a claim against the property as if the debts were liens against it, which they are not because the land was never Daniel's to borrow against." Grant sat down at the table. He set his hat on his knee. "You hired a lawyer." "I wrote to one in Abilene. He wrote back and said my case had merit, but that pursuing it would cost more than I had and would require me to appear in court, which would require me to leave the homestead, which Croft could then use as abandonment." She looked at him steadily over the rim of her mug. "So I decided to stay put and let Croft send someone to me and deal with it when it arrived." She paused. "You arrived." "I did," he agreed. There was something sitting between them at the table that had no name yet, some charge in the air, quiet and dangerous, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. Grant was aware of it and set it aside because the situation demanded clarity, not distraction. "Tell me about Croft," he said. She poured the coffee. It was strong and dark and smelled like the real thing, not the chicory substitute that passed for coffee in half the establishments in southwest Texas. He noticed this and filed it away without knowing why. "Silas Croft came to Dustfall about 2 years ago," she said, settling across from him. "He says he's in cattle, but mostly what he does is buy debt." He finds men who borrowed money they can't pay back, or who made bad investments, or who died and left their families holding obligations they never understood, and he buys those obligations for pennies. Then he collects at face value, or he takes the property. She wrapped both hands around her mug. He's done it to 3 families in this county that I know about. The Hennessy farm, the Ortiz place out near the creek, the Bales family who had been here since before the war. She met his eyes. All of them had less clear legal standing than I do. None of them had a deed like mine, and every single one of them is gone. Grant felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. And no one filed a complaint, he said. Oh, they filed. With the county sheriff's office in Abilene. You know what the Abilene sheriff's office did? She tilted her head slightly. They sent a marshal to execute the evictions. The silence in the room was heavy and specific. Grant thought about the paperwork that had been sitting on his desk when he arrived at the office 3 days ago. The eviction notice for the Mercer property. Neat, official, stamped. He had not questioned it because the paperwork had been in order, and that was how the system was supposed to work. You trusted the system, you executed the orders. You did not invent reasons to suspect fraud when none was visible. He had not invented fraud, but it had been there, hidden in the bureaucratic confidence of the documents, waiting for a woman with a rifle and a deed to expose it. He had been used. That knowledge sat in his gut like a stone. How many people in the county know what Croft is doing? He asked. Enough to whisper about it, Maria said. Not enough to stop it. Why not? She looked at him with an expression that was patient and just slightly tired, the way a teacher looks at a student who has asked a question with an obvious answer. Because Croft has money. And money in this county means connections. And connections mean the right men looking the other way. And the right men looking the other way means that the wrong men like you, with badges and honest intentions and papers to execute, ride out to do work they don't know is dirty. She picked up her mug. Until someone shows them a deed they cannot argue with. Grant sat with that for a moment. Outside, the morning wind moved against the windows, and somewhere distant a hawk called once and then went quiet. I need to go back to Dustfall, he said. I need to see the full record at the county clerk's office here, whatever's been filed locally, and I need to send a wire to Abilene to put a hold on that eviction order pending investigation. Something shifted in her eyes. Not hope. Exactly, hope was too fragile for whatever Maria Mercer ran on, but something adjacent to it. You believe me, she said. I read your deed, he said. It's not about belief, it's about the law. She nodded, slow and careful, like she was storing the statement away for later use. Grant stood and put his hat back on. Lock your doors tonight, Mrs. Mercer. If Croft hears that the eviction didn't go through, he may try something less official. She looked at him steadily. Marshal Archer, I have been locking my doors alone for 14 months. I know how to take care of myself. I know you do, he said. I watched you aim that rifle. The corner of her mouth moved barely, just enough to qualify as something. He was not sure what to call it yet. He rode back toward Dustfall with his jaw set, and his mind moving at a hard gallop, turning over everything she had told him, and everything the deed implied, and everything the paperwork on his desk had carefully not said. By the time the town came into view through the dust and heat shimmer, he had already decided that this was not a simple eviction gone wrong. This was something structured and deliberate, and it had been running right under his nose, and someone was going to answer for it. He just needed to know who, and how deep it went. Dustfall in 1882 was not a small town, and not yet a large one. It occupied that peculiar middle territory of the Texas frontier, where the railroad had arrived recently enough that the old cattle drive economy and the new mercantile economy were still in active negotiation. There was a main street with a bank, 2 general stores, a telegraph office, a courthouse annex that handled county records, a hotel, 3 saloons, a livery stable, and a scattering of smaller businesses. Grant had a small office on the 2nd floor of the courthouse annex, with 2 windows and a view of the street that he appreciated for professional reasons. He went to the county clerk's office first. The clerk was a thin, nervous man named Aldous Pratt who wore his hair parted precisely down the middle, and who looked at Grant with the expression of someone who had been hoping to get through the day without anything complicated happening. "I need to see everything related to the Mercer property," Grant said. "All filings, going back to the original deed registration." Aldous Pratt's hand stopped moving over the papers on his desk. "Marshal Archer," he said carefully, "the Croft filing on that property is legal," Grant said. "I'm starting to wonder about that. Pull the records, Mr. Pratt, all of them." The records took 40 minutes to locate and arrange, and what they showed Grant was a story told in careful bureaucratic language that concealed, barely, its own intention. The Mercer deed, Maria's deed, signed by Eduardo Mercer in 1879 and properly recorded, was there. It had not been destroyed or removed. It had simply been filed. And then a year ago, a competing claim from Silas Croft had been filed on top of it, referencing a purchase agreement with one Daniel Mercer that did not acknowledge the prior deed at all. Either whoever processed Croft's filing had not checked the prior records, which would have required a spectacular dereliction of professional duty, or they had checked and been paid to proceed anyway. Grant looked at Aldous Pratt, who was looking at a spot on the wall approximately 3 feet to the left of Grant's head. "Who processed the Croft filing?" Grant asked. I believe my predecessor did, Mr. Holloway. He left the county last summer." Grant considered this. "Conveniently," Pratt said nothing. "I need the original Mercer deed copied," Grant said, "officially with your seal, and I need the Croft competing claim flagged as pending investigation as of today." He leaned on the counter. "You understand what I'm saying, Mr. Pratt, today, this afternoon, before Silas Croft hears anything about today's events and has the opportunity to make any additional filings." Pratt swallowed visibly. "Yes, Marshal. Thank you." From the clerk's office, Grant went to the telegraph office, where he sent a wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin, not Abilene, because Abilene was already compromised in his mind, laying out the situation in plain language, and requesting a legal hold on all Croft-related eviction proceedings in Brewster County pending investigation. He did not know how long the response would take, or what the response would be, but he needed the official record to show that he had flagged this, and flagged it clearly on this specific day. Then he went looking for Silas Croft. He found him, as he had half expected to, in the better of the two saloons on Main Street, the one with the polished bar and the actual glassware, the one that attracted men who considered themselves a cut above the average cattle drover. Croft was seated at a table near the back with 2 other men whose faces Grant had seen in town, but whose names he did not yet know, and he was drinking whiskey in the manner of a man who expected good news to arrive before noon and was getting a head start on celebrating. Silas Croft was perhaps 50, broad across the chest, with iron-gray hair and the kind of permanent tan that came from years in the Texas sun. He had a businessman's careful eyes, the kind that were always calculating, always measuring, never entirely revealing what they found. He looked up when Grant walked in, and something in his expression performed a rapid and almost invisible adjustment, settling from easy confidence into something more cautious. "Marshal Archer," he said, "I expected you an hour ago. How did it go with the widow?" Grant sat down across from him without being invited. The 2 other men shifted slightly in their chairs, alert in the way that men who had learned to be alert were. Grant noted them and set them aside for the moment. "It didn't go," he said. Croft's eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon." "The eviction didn't go. Mrs. Mercer has a valid prior deed, recorded in 1879, before her husband's debts, before your purchase of those debts, before any claim you have even the faintest legal right to assert against that property." Grant kept his voice pleasant and level, the same voice he might use discussing the weather or the price of grain. He had learned years ago that calm voices made dangerous men nervous in a way that loud ones did not. "I've flagged your competing claim as pending investigation and sent a wire to Austin requesting a hold on all related proceedings." Croft set his whiskey glass down. The two men on either side of him were very still. "You overstepped," Croft said. The pleasantness was gone from his voice, replaced by something flat and deliberate. "Did I?" Grant said. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the overstepping happened before I arrived. Someone filed a claim against property that was already legally held, using a purchase agreement with a man who had no legal authority to sell. That's fraud, Mr. Croft. And fraud in land dealings is a federal matter when it involves documents filed with a county recorder." Croft said nothing for a long moment. He picked up his glass again. He turned it slightly in his fingers, watching the amber liquid catch the bar's thin light. "You should be careful," he said finally. "You're new here. You don't know how things work in this county." "I'm learning fast," Grant said. He stood. "Don't go anywhere, Mr. Croft. I'll have more questions for you once Austin responds to my wire." He walked out into the afternoon sun and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, breathing through the exchange, feeling the weight of what he had just done. He had just made an enemy of a man who had money and connections and a demonstrated willingness to operate outside the law. He was aware of this. He was not particularly afraid of it, but he was aware of it, because awareness was how you stayed alive. His awareness also included the fact that he was now more worried about Maria Mercer than he had been 3 hours ago. He rode back out to the homestead before sundown. She was in the small vegetable garden on the south side of the house when he arrived, crouched between rows of something green that he thought might be beans. She heard his horse and stood and watched him approach with the same direct, undecorated attention she had given him that morning. The rifle was not in her hands this time, but he was fairly certain it was within reach. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She considered this, dusting her hands on her dress. "Men in my experience often say things they do not follow through on." "That's a fair thing to say about men in general," Grant agreed. He got down from his horse and tied it to the porch rail. "I need to tell you what happened today. I think you need to know." She invited him in again. This time the coffee was already made strong and dark and real, same as before, and she poured without asking. He sat at her table and told her everything. The clerk's records, the flagged claim, the wire to Austin, the conversation with Croft. He left nothing out, because she had been operating in the dark for 14 months and she deserved the full picture. She listened without interrupting, sitting very still with both hands around her mug, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment. "He won't stop," she said. "No," Grant agreed. "Not voluntarily. He'll find another angle, another document, another clerk." She said it without drama, just cataloging the problem the way you catalog a crop threat or a structural weakness in a fence. "Probably," Grant said. "Which is why I need you to let me help you build the strongest possible legal record for your ownership of this land. Official copies of every document, sworn statements, witnesses who knew your father when he made the original deed." He paused. "Is there anyone like that?" "People who were here when your father filed. Pastor Holloway knew my father," she said. "Not the same Holloway as your departed clerk, the minister at the church here. He did services at this property when I was a child. And Mrs. Caldwell, who runs the boarding house on 2nd Street, she knew my father. They were friends. I'll need to speak with both of them." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning between them. Now evening had come in while they talked, and the soft light made her expression harder to read than it had been in the morning. Or perhaps she was simply letting her guard down by a fraction, which made her harder to interpret rather than easier. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Grant thought about the answer. He gave her the honest one. "Because I was handed fraudulent papers and I almost executed an illegal eviction on a woman who had clear legal right to her property. That makes me partly responsible for the injustice, even if I didn't know what I was carrying. I don't walk away from that." She studied him. Whatever she was looking for, he seemed to pass the test because she nodded once. "The Hennessy family," she said. "And the Ortiz family and the Bales family, they were wrong too." "I know," he said. "One thing at a time, but yes." She poured more coffee, which he took as a gesture of cautious goodwill. "There's a spare room at the back of the house," she said. "It was Daniel's study. I've been using it for storage." She met his eyes. "It's not proper for you to stay, I know that, but if Croft sends men tonight, I'd rather not be alone, and the ride back to Dustfall and back again is impractical." She said it plainly, without embarrassment, the way a practical woman states a practical fact. "You can sleep there. There's a bolt on the door." "I appreciate that," he said, equally plain. The bolt was not entirely for her benefit, though he did not say so. The next 2 weeks were among the most complicated and quietly revelatory of Grant Archer's professional life, and that included the year he spent tracking counterfeit currency through 3 states. He rode between the homestead and Dustfall daily, sometimes twice daily, building the legal case that would make Maria's ownership of the land impossible to challenge. He interviewed Pastor Holloway, who remembered Eduardo Mercer with warmth and specificity, and who had the original ceremonial Bible from the Mercer household that contained a family record in Eduardo's handwriting: birth dates, marriage dates, property notes. He talked to Mrs. Caldwell at the boarding house, who produced a letter Eduardo had written to her shortly before his death in which he referred to the deed as Maria's absolute inheritance. He found 2 elderly men in the county who had witnessed the original deed signing in 1879, and who were still alive and willing to make sworn statements. He assembled all of this into a file that grew thick and definitive, and he sent copies to Austin with a detailed account of everything he had found. And in between all of this, he kept coming back to the homestead, morning coffee at Maria's table, evenings on the porch when the day's heat finally broke, and the stars came out over the high desert in their thousands, enormous and indifferent and deeply beautiful. He was not entirely sure when the professional necessity of those visits had begun to be supplemented by something else, but he noticed, during the 3rd week, that he was finding reasons to stay later than strictly required, and that she was not asking him to leave. Maria Mercer was not a woman who revealed herself quickly. She was not cold. She was, in fact, warmer than her iron first impression suggested, but she had the quality of someone who had been hurt in specific and particular ways and had built herself carefully around those hurts, so that the outer shell was strong while the inside continued, quietly, to live. He saw it in the way she talked about her father with open love, unhesitating, and in the way she talked about her husband without love, without bitterness, simply with the accuracy of someone reporting history. He gathered over many evenings that the marriage to Daniel Mercer had been a practical arrangement more than a passionate one. Daniel had come to Dustfall looking for land and stability, and Maria had been a woman alone after her father's death, and the arrangement had made practical sense to both of them. She had not been unhappy, she said. She had been adequate, which she acknowledged, looking out at the darkening desert, was perhaps not enough to call a marriage. "My father warned me," she said one evening. They were on the porch, watching the sun pull the last of its color down behind the ridge. "He said Daniel was a good man but a worried one, that he carried debt the way some men carry a flask, always with him, always a little bit in use." She was quiet for a moment. "He was right. And your father?" Grant said. She smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile fully, not the barely there movement of the morning she showed him the deed, but an actual, open smile that changed her face into something that made him lose his train of thought entirely for a second. "My father was the son of a rancher from Sonora," she said. "He came north when he was 22 with a mule and a leather case of surveying tools and a determination that would have intimidated the Rocky Mountains. He acquired this land through the Homestead Act. He built this house with his own hands and 2 neighbors' hands. He read to me every night from those books." She nodded toward the window. "Latin, French, English, Spanish. He believed that the one thing no one could take from you was what was inside your head." She paused. "He was almost right. Almost. They tried to take it anyway," she said. "Or they're trying, with papers and clerks and men on horses." She looked at him when she said men on horses, and he felt the sting of it because he was supposed to feel it. "They sent the wrong man on the horse," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her gaze shifted, softened in a way that was not weakness but was decidedly vulnerable. The way water is soft and also cuts stone given enough time. Maybe they did, she said. He rode back to Dustfall that night with the sound of her voice following him the entire way. The response from Austin came in the fourth week, and it was good news and complicated news packaged together, which was how most news in Grant's experience arrived. The good news was that the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin had reviewed his filing and agreed that the Croft competing claim was fraudulent, that Maria Mercer's prior deed was legally valid and incontestable, and that Silas Croft was now under federal investigation for land fraud. The hold on all eviction proceedings was confirmed and extended. A senior deputy from the Austin office was being dispatched to Brewster County to assist in the investigation of Croft's activities, including the 3 prior cases involving the Hennessy, Ortiz, and Bales properties. The complicated news was that Croft had apparently anticipated the wind changing direction. He had liquidated a significant portion of his local holdings over the past week, and there were reports of him making arrangements to relocate, which was not illegal, but which suggested he was aware that the federal attention was coming. Grant went straight to Croft's office on Main Street, which turned out to be in the process of being vacated by 2 men carrying boxes. He walked in and found Croft behind a half-empty desk, and the pleasantness was entirely gone from Croft's face now, replaced by something that was not quite fear and not quite defiance but lived in the uncomfortable middle. "You're not leaving town," Grant said. "I'm a free man in a free country," Croft said. "You're a man under federal investigation for land fraud," Grant said. "You leave this county before the deputy from Austin arrives, and that's flight from investigation." "I will arrest you this morning, Mr. Croft. I am telling you directly." Croft leaned back in his chair and looked at Grant with eyes that had the cold shine of a man who has gambled and lost and is deciding whether to flip the table. The 2 men with boxes had gone still and watchful. "You made an enemy," Croft said. "You made the enemies," Grant said. 3 families that I know of and a 4th you tried and failed to add. You just didn't know the last one had a prior deed and a rifle." He kept his eyes steady. "Sit down, Mr. Croft. The deputy from Austin will be here in 4 days. You can tell your story then." Croft sat. He was not happy about it, and the unhappiness in his eyes was the kind that made promises about later, but he sat. Grant put one of Croft's own men to the task of keeping an informal eye on the office, not official, not stated, just a quiet arrangement, and then he rode out to the homestead to tell Maria what had happened. She was inside when he arrived, at the table with the spread of documents she had been helping him organize, her reading glasses on the end of her nose. He had not known she wore reading glasses, and the domestic detail of it hit him somewhere entirely unexpected, warm and specific. She pulled them off when he came in and looked at him, reading his face. "Good news," she said. "Mostly," he said and told her. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she put her face in her hands, not crying exactly, but breathing through something large, something that had been held at bay for a very long time and was only now being permitted to move. He sat down beside her at the table. He had never sat beside her before, always across, always with the table between them like a respectable boundary. But now he sat beside her close enough that he could feel the warmth of her and could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. "Maria," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were bright, but her jaw was set. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the worst of it is past. Your land is safe." She looked at him for a long time, the way she had looked at him the very first morning from the porch, measuring, calculating, deciding. But the rifle was not between them now, and the thing she was deciding was different from what she had been deciding on that first morning. "You came back," she said, and she meant more than just that afternoon. "I said I would," he said. "You said that already. It's still true." Something broke open in her expression, very quietly, like a door opened carefully after a long winter. Her hand was on the table and he covered it with his, just his hand over hers, warm and still. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat there in the quiet of the afternoon with the papers spread between them and the sunlight coming through the western window, and 14 months of her being alone, and whatever length of time his own loneliness had been going on, all of it present and acknowledged in the warmth of that joined contact. "I should probably tell you something," Grant said. "Should you?" she said, and the edge of a smile was back. "I rode out here that first morning not wanting this job. I had told myself that before I left. I don't like eviction orders. They always mean someone is losing something they shouldn't lose." He looked at their joined hands. "But I did the job because it was my job, and I am telling you that I am glad in the strangest way that I did, because otherwise I would not have met you." She was very still. Then she said, "You came to throw me off my land. I did. And now I would very much like to stay on it for as long as you'll permit me." The smile came fully then, unhidden and unguarded, and it remade her face in a way that made his chest ache with something he had not felt in so long. He'd almost stopped believing it was still possible. "That," she said, "is the most self-contradicting offer I have ever received." "It's the only one I've got," he said. She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and outside the desert wind moved easy and warm through the junipers. The deputy from Austin arrived 5 days later, a solid, methodical man named Holt, who had the face of someone who had been investigating fraud for 20 years and had stopped being surprised by its forms. He reviewed Grant's file with great thoroughness, and then interviewed Croft for 6 hours over 2 days, and then, on the evening of the second day, came to find Grant at the homestead. Maria had made dinner, actual dinner, not just coffee, a fact that Holt noted with professional neutrality and Grant noted with something considerably warmer. They ate together at the table, and Holt laid out what he had found. The Croft operation was larger than Grant had estimated. There were 17 fraudulent property claims in 4 counties, going back 6 years. The departed clerk, Holloway, had been on Croft's payroll for 3 of those years. There was a man in the Abilene Records office who had also been compensated, though he was apparently prepared to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration of his circumstances. "The Hennessy property, the Ortiz property, and the Bales property," Holt said, looking at his notes. "Those claims can be challenged and reversed, though the process will take time. The families would need to file with federal court." He looked at Grant. "You'll need to document what you know about each case." "I'll do it," Grant said. "It won't be quick," Holt said. "Most things worth doing aren't." Holt left after dinner. Maria washed the dishes and Grant dried them, standing side by side at the basin in the same easy domestic rhythm they had somehow fallen into over the past weeks without ever discussing it. The normalcy of it was extraordinary. He had lived alone for 9 years, since his wife, Eleanor, had died in childbirth in 1873, taking the child with her, leaving him alone in a Missouri farmhouse in the middle of winter with the specific kind of grief that has no bottom to it. He had moved west the following year and become a lawman because it gave him motion and purpose, 2 things that approximate hope when actual hope is not available. He had not expected another door to open. He set down the last dried plate, and Maria hung the dish towel on its hook and turned to find him closer than the usual careful distance they had maintained, and she looked up at him with an expression that was very clear and very open and very much a question. He answered it by cupping her face gently in both hands and kissing her, soft and careful, the way you handle something precious that you are terrified of breaking. She kissed him back with considerably less tentativeness than he had offered, which made him laugh against her mouth, and she laughed too, and the sound of it in the quiet house was startling and wonderful. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "It keeps being true." She put her head against his chest, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and the night full of stars outside the window, and he felt something settle in him that had been displaced for 9 years, falling back into place like a bone into its socket, painful for a moment and then right, deeply and undeniably right. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. But for this moment, in this kitchen, with this woman, the work could wait. It took 6 months to fully dismantle the structure of Silas Croft's operation, and Grant was involved in most of it. Croft was formally charged in federal court in the autumn of 1882, facing 7 counts of land fraud with more potentially forthcoming as the investigation continued. He would eventually plead to 4 counts in exchange for cooperation and receive a sentence of 8 years, which was not enough for what he had done but was something, and something was better than nothing. The Deputy Holt pursued the case through the winter, but most of the local documentation work fell to Grant, who found himself doubling as an informal advocate for the 3 dispossessed families. The legal processes were slow and expensive, and not always fair. The Bales family had the most straightforward path to recovering their land, and they still spent 2 years in temporary housing, while the courts moved at their stately pace. The Ortiz family's situation was complicated by a competing claim from a legitimate buyer who had purchased part of the property from Croft in good faith and had to be compensated. The Hennessy's eventually recovered the core of their land, but not the outlying acreage. It was not perfect justice, but it was closer to justice than they had had before, and Grant held that as the relevant standard. Through all of it, he rode back and forth between Dustfall and the homestead, though the homestead was increasingly his destination at the end of the day rather than a professional stop. He had let his room at the boarding house in Dustfall go by the 3rd month. Maria had suggested, with characteristic directness, that it made more practical sense for him to base himself at the homestead, given that most of his active work was in that direction, and they were both adults, and the storage room at the back of the house was, she said, adequate for his needs. He had told her with considerable amusement that he appreciated her practical approach to the arrangement. She had told him that she was a practical woman, and he should have known that already. He had agreed that he absolutely should have. They got married in November of 1882. The ceremony was at the church in Dustfall, performed by Pastor Holloway, who had tears in his eyes when he pronounced them married, and who had told Grant privately beforehand that Eduardo Mercer would have been deeply satisfied by this outcome. Maria wore a dress that was pale green and simply cut, with her dark hair loose for once, falling past her shoulders, and she looked like someone who had finally, after a very long siege, allowed themselves to be entirely at rest. She held his hand through the ceremony with the same determined grip she had used in that first impossible moment in the kitchen, and she said her vows clearly and without hesitation, and when it was over she kissed him before Pastor Holloway had finished saying Amen, which made the handful of guests laugh and made Grant so happy he felt it like a physical impact. Mrs. Caldwell from the boarding house was there. Holt had come up from Austin because he said he had never attended the wedding of someone whose case file he had personally built, and it seemed like an interesting experience. The Ortiz family sent flowers. The Hennessy boy, who was 16 and had apparently developed a devoted admiration for Grant's professional judgment over the preceding months, stood in the back with his hat pressed to his chest and nodded vigorously during the whole ceremony. They rode back to the homestead together in the afternoon, the sun going long and golden across the desert, and it was the same ride Grant had made 100 times in the preceding months, but it was entirely different, because now when the house came into view with its worn porch and its garden and the red ridge behind it, it was not a destination he was approaching. It was home. He helped her down from her horse, which was technically unnecessary since she was as competent on horseback as she was at everything else, but she allowed it with a smile, and he kept her hand when she was on the ground and did not let go. "My father would have liked you," she said, looking at the house. "Tell me why," he said. He valued men who did what they said they would do, who could change their minds when the evidence required it, but never changed them when the pressure required it. "Those are different things," he always said. She looked at him. "You came here to evict me." "I did. And then you looked at the evidence." "I did. And then you stayed." "I did," he said. "And I intend to keep doing it." She turned to him fully and put her arms around him, and held him out there in the open in the golden afternoon, with no rifle and no deed and no table between them. And he held her back as the day settled around them both. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that gets laid down in a person like a foundation, deep and structural, bearing the weight of everything that comes after. Grant continued his marshal duties, which kept him busy, but he reorganized his routes so that he was rarely more than a half-day's ride from the homestead, and on the days he was in Dustfall, he generally came back by dark. Maria managed the property with the same combination of intelligence and physical competence that characterized everything she did. She planted an expanded kitchen garden in the spring. She negotiated the purchase of 2 additional cows from a neighbor to the north, a transaction she conducted with such precision that the neighbor told Grant afterward that he felt he had been professionally outmaneuvered by a woman who definitely could have been running a business. Grant had agreed that this was probably accurate. They talked in the evenings the way people talk who are genuinely interested in each other, not the polite exchange of necessary information, but real conversation, the kind where you follow threads into unexpected places and come out knowing something you hadn't known before. He told her about Missouri, about Alina, about the years of moving and not settling. She told him things about her father and her childhood on this land that she had not spoken aloud to anyone. He thought, in a very long time, stories that came out carefully at first, and then more easily, as though the telling of them was something she had kept locked up and was now discovering she could open. She was patient with his silences, which could be long. He was patient with her opinions, which were many and firmly held and occasionally in vigorous disagreement with his. They had arguments that were interesting. He had not expected that the specific pleasure of arguing with someone who was genuinely your intellectual match, where you might lose as often as you won, and where losing was not a defeat but an education. He loved her in a way that was different from how he had loved Alina, not less but differently, the way one landscape is different from another without either being inferior. Alina had been the love of his youth, tender and bright and cut terribly short. Maria was the love of his rebuilt self, the self that had been put back together from grief and motion and purpose, and that turned out to have more room in it than he had imagined. She loved him in a way she had not loved anyone. She told him one evening frankly, which she followed immediately with the caveat that she had not had a great deal of comparative experience, to which he responded that the comparison was entirely favorable from his end regardless. In the second spring of their marriage, she told him, on a morning in March when the desert was just beginning its brief and violent flowering, that she thought she might be expecting. He sat with that for a moment at the breakfast table, the coffee cooling between his hands, and she watched him with the characteristic patience she brought to important things, waiting for him to process. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Complicated," she said, which was honest. "Hopeful, a little frightened." She paused. "Your turn." "Complicated," he said. "Hopeful, more than a little frightened." He looked at her across the table, and very, very glad. She reached across and covered his hand with hers, the same way he had covered hers on the day the news came from Austin, a gesture that had become their private language for things too large and important for ordinary words. Their son was born in October of 1883, in the bedroom at the back of the homestead, with a midwife from Dustfall in attendance, and Grant stationed outside the door, maintaining the pretense that he was giving Maria privacy, while actually being unable to move more than 20 feet from the sound of her voice. When the midwife came out and told him he had a son, he sat down heavily on the porch steps and put his face in his hands for a moment, not from grief, but from the sheer structural weight of being that happy, which is its own kind of overwhelming. They named him Eduardo, for Maria's father. Eduardo Grant Mercer Archer, in full, because Maria felt strongly that both grandfathers should be represented, and Grant's father had been a good man named William Grant Archer who had worked a farm in Missouri and believed in the law and would, Maria stated, have been honored to have a descendant bearing his son's name. Grant had not been able to argue with this. He was finding, in general, that arguing with Maria required both very good grounds and the emotional stamina to follow through. And on the subject of his son's name, he had neither the grounds nor the stamina because he was too busy being quietly overcome by the fact of the child. Eduardo was a serious baby who regarded the world with his mother's direct gaze and his father's tendency toward long consideration before acting, which made for a very watchful infant who seemed to be taking notes. He had Maria's dark hair and coloring, and what Grant strongly suspected were his own ears, a suspicion Maria confirmed with the cruelty of the deeply amused. The homestead filled up with Eduardo's presence in the way that houses fill up with children, not just with noise, though there was noise, but with a quality of aliveness, a sense of constant forward motion toward the next thing, the next word, the next discovery. Grant had not known he had a capacity for this, for fatherhood specifically, for the daily intimate work of raising someone from nothing toward themselves. He had thought, after 1873, that the door to this particular room had closed. He had been wrong, and the wrongness of that earlier conclusion was one of the best surprises of his life. In the spring of 1884, Grant received a promotion, or more precisely, a reorganization of the district that gave him additional jurisdiction and a small staff of 2 deputies. He took the role seriously, which meant more administrative work, which he disliked, and more accountability for outcomes across a wider territory, which he valued, and more paperwork, which he managed by doing it at the kitchen table in the evenings after Eduardo was asleep while Maria read nearby, which made even paperwork reasonably tolerable. He also, in that same year, finished the documentation work on the 3 dispossessed families' cases. The Bales family recovered their land, all of it, and moved back in the summer with a celebration that involved a great deal of food and a fiddle player who was not technically proficient, but was extremely enthusiastic. Grant and Maria attended, and Eduardo, who was 8 months old and had opinions about the fiddle's volume, expressed them freely. The Hennessy situation resolved with the family retaining their house and their best acreage, which was not everything they had lost, but was enough to build forward from. The father, a quiet man named Joseph, shook Grant's hand outside the courthouse in dustfall with both of his own hands and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "Thank you," in a voice that carried everything it needed to. The Ortiz family's outcome was the most complicated, involving a compensation arrangement and a legal settlement with the good faith buyer. But by the end of 1884, they had returned to a portion of their land and had the financial resources to make a genuine start. Maria had written to them 3 times during the process, letters that were practical and warm in equal measure, and the letters they received back were in Spanish, which Maria read aloud to Grant in the evenings with running translation. Silas Croft's trial concluded in the fall of 1884, 8 years, as previously established. The sentence was carried out and Croft was transported to a federal facility. Grant felt no satisfaction about this beyond the abstract satisfaction of a completed process. He had learned, over the course of his career, that the punishment of wrongdoers was not the point of justice. The restoration of what was wrongfully taken was the point. The punishment was just how you discouraged it from happening again. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and long, the kind of Texas winter that people from other parts of the country do not expect, but that the high desert delivers without apology. The homestead's stone walls held heat well, which Eduardo Mercer the elder had apparently understood when he built them, and the family of 3 spent the dark months in the intimacy of a well-insulated house, with a fire that rarely went out and enough to eat and more to talk about than any winter could contain. Grant taught himself to bake bread, badly at first, and then with improving competence, which Maria chronicled with loving and specific commentary on each attempt. Eduardo the younger developed the capacity for independent movement, and promptly used it to investigate every corner of every room at speed, producing a level of vigilance in both parents that had not previously been necessary. On a clear night in February, when the cold was especially sharp and Eduardo was sleeping and the fire was banked and the lamp on the table was burning low, Maria sat across from Grant with a book open in her hands that she was not reading, and after a while she said, "I have been thinking." He looked up. "Should I be worried?" "No," she said, though the smile suggested possibly yes. "I have been thinking about the property." About whether it is enough, or whether she paused, organizing the thought. "My father's deed covered 160 acres. There are 40 acres on the north side that border the property that are currently unclaimed as far as the county records show. I looked into it last week when I was in town." Grant put down his own reading. "You want to file for the additional acreage. Under the Homestead Act, it's possible. We've been working this land actively, we have improvements, we've been resident continuously." She tilted her head. "And with Eduardo growing, the question of what kind of holding he inherits is relevant." "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since before he was born," she said, which he should have expected. "File," he said. "I'll support whatever documentation is needed." She smiled, and the specific quality of that smile, satisfied and conspiratorial and entirely at home, settled around him like warmth. "I already drafted the paperwork," she said. He laughed, genuine and full. "Of course you did." The additional 40 acres were approved without complication in the spring of 1885. The combined property was now 200 acres, enough for a genuine working ranch if they chose to pursue it, which Maria was already planning, and Grant was already supporting because he had learned that where Maria had a plan, the most productive thing was to stand next to it. They hired a hand, a young man named Samuel Reyes, 19 years old, nephew of the Ortiz family, who was hardworking and good with horses, and initially extremely formal with Grant on account of the badge before relaxing into something easier. Samuel ate dinner with them on working days and had a clear and specific admiration for Maria's authority and for Eduardo's personality, which was developing into something that combined his mother's directness with his father's quieter intensity and was absolutely his own. The summer of 1885 brought heat and good rain in unusual combination, which meant the vegetable garden exceeded itself and the pasture stayed green longer than expected, and the homestead had a quality of actual plenty that felt, Maria said one evening, like something her father had worked toward and never quite lived to see fully. "He would have seen it," Grant said. "He just didn't know it. He planted the seed, Maria. Everything you've built from it, it came from what he started." She was quiet for a while. "Do you think he would have approved of you?" "I came here to take away everything he built," Grant said, "so probably not initially." "Initially," she said, and the emphasis was light and precise. "I'd like to think I would have convinced him." "You convinced me," she said, "and I am significantly harder to convince than my father was." "I have noticed," he said. She laughed, and he reached across the distance between their chairs on the porch and took her hand, the way he always did, the way that had become as natural as breathing, her hand in his in the cooling evening with the red ridge going dark against the sky and the stars beginning their careful occupation of the night. "I would have fought for this land forever," she said quietly, "alone if I had to." "I know you would have," he said. "But I am glad," she said, "that I didn't have to." He turned her hand over and pressed his lips to the palm of it, a gesture he had started doing at some point in the first year of their marriage, and that she had never commented on but always permitted with a stillness that told him it meant something to her. "So am I," he said. In the fall of 1885, Maria told him she was expecting again. This time there was less complicated and more straightforwardly glad on both sides, because the first time around had been its own education, and this time They both knew what they were walking toward. The second child arrived in April of 1886, a daughter this time, who came into the world loudly and immediately, and with what the midwife described as impressive urgency. They named her Rosa Elena, for Maria's mother Elena, who had died when Maria was very young, and whom Maria remembered more as a feeling than a face, warmth and music, and a particular way of singing while she worked. Rosa was, from the beginning, the opposite of Eduardo in temperament. Where he observed and considered, she moved immediately toward the nearest interesting thing, which kept everyone around her in a state of heightened alertness and entertained incredulity. Eduardo, 2.5 years old and solemn about the new arrangement, inspected his sister with great thoroughness on the day she came home, and then announced that she was very small and would probably improve, which Grant thought was a generous assessment. Samuel Reyes, who had become by this point genuinely part of the household's daily fabric, took one look at Rosa and declared that this child was going to give everyone gray hair, which Maria agreed with and Grant suspected was accurate. The homestead was full. That was the word Grant returned to again and again in his private accounting of his life, full. Not in a crowded or overwhelming sense, but in the sense of a vessel that has been filled to its proper capacity, that contains what it was made to hold. He had spent 9 years empty, or something close to it, and he had not known exactly how empty until the fullness showed him the contrast. His work continued, because the territory still had its demands and the law did not slow down for personal happiness. But he was better at it, he thought, than he had been before, more patient, more rooted, better able to extend the kind of deliberate fairness that the work required, because he was not doing it from a place of displaced grief anymore. He was doing it from a place of genuine investment in the world his children would grow up in, which was a cleaner and more sustaining motivation. He built a second bedroom onto the house in the summer of 1886, doing much of the physical work himself with Samuel's help, in a kind of tribute to Eduardo Mercer the elder, who had built the original with his own hands. Maria supervised with the same engaged authority she brought to everything, which meant the project was executed with considerably more accuracy than it would have been without her input. The addition changed the house's shape, made it larger and more settled looking, as though it had always planned to be this size and was simply arriving at what it had intended. Grant stood back and looked at it one afternoon, the house with its new addition, and Maria came to stand beside him with Rosa on her hip and Eduardo at her knee, and he thought, this is what it looks like when something is built to last. Not perfect. Imperfect in all the specific and ordinary ways that real things are imperfect. But solid, real, present. Built on ground that no one was going to take away, because there was a deed in a box under the bed that the whole federal legal system had now confirmed, and there was a marshal who wore his badge in the service of the same law that protected it, and there was a woman who had once held a rifle at his chest and shown him something he could not argue with. He put his arm around Maria and she leaned into him, adjusting Rosa against her hip with the ease of someone for whom this, too, had become as natural as breathing. "You're looking pleased with yourself," she said. "Looking at something I helped build," he said. "I'm allowed." "The room is still a little uneven on the north wall," she said. "It is," he agreed, "but it's solid." "Yes," she said, "it is." Eduardo tugged at his father's hand and said, in the seriously matter-of-fact tone that was entirely his own, "Papa, is that our house now?" "It always was," Grant said, crouching to his son's level. "We just made it bigger." Eduardo considered this with characteristic thoroughness and then nodded, satisfied with the answer. Rosa, who had opinions about everything and the vocal range to express them, chose this moment to announce something in her own pre-verbal language, emphatically and at some volume. "I believe she agrees," Maria said dryly. Grant stood and kissed his wife's temple and his daughter's forehead and took his son's hand, and they walked together back toward the house that was their own. The years moved in the way that good years move, quickly and richly, each one full of enough that you feel at the end of it that you have lived several seasons rather than one. Grant rode his territory and came home to his family, and watched his children grow from fascinating infants into actual people, with opinions and skills and preferences he had not anticipated. Eduardo, who was quiet and precise, developed a passion for the stars that led Grant to buy him a small refracting telescope from a catalog, which Eduardo used with such devotion that he was up at odd hours on clear nights and could name constellations in Spanish, English, and the Latin his mother taught him from her father's books. Rosa, who remained in emphatic and energetic possession of every room she entered, learned to ride at 4 years old and was already at 5, faster on horseback than most adults Grant knew, which he celebrated, and Maria observed with the particular wariness of a mother who has correctly anticipated future hazards. In 1888, Grant received a formal commendation from the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin for his work on the Croft case and related land fraud investigations, which had by that point led to the prosecution of 2 additional fraudulent schemes in neighboring counties. He received the commendation at the courthouse in Dustfall with Maria beside him and Eduardo holding his hand, and Rosa, who was 2, being held by Samuel Reyes with the expression of someone who has accepted a difficult but important assignment. After the formal presentation, the county recorder, a new man, not Aldous Pratt who had retired, but a younger man named Collins who ran an honest office, said to Grant privately that the Mercer deed was the most cited document in the county now, referenced in every discussion of prior claims and competing filings as the standard by which validity was assessed. Something about it, Collins said, being airtight from the beginning. The woman knew what she had. Grant smiled. She usually does, he said. Maria, who had been talking to Mrs. Caldwell across the room, looked over at that moment and caught his smile and raised an eyebrow in inquiry, and he shook his head slightly later, and she nodded once and went back to her conversation, the easy shorthand of 2 people who have learned each other thoroughly enough to communicate across a room. That evening, after the children were asleep and Samuel had gone to his bunk in the barn, Grant and Maria sat on the porch in the warm August dark. The stars were enormous, the way Texas stars always are, and the fireflies were doing their intermittent signaling in the grass at the edge of the garden, and the night smelled of heat and sage and the faint sweetness of whatever was blooming on the south slope. "Tell me something," Maria said. He turned to look at her. "What? Tell me something you haven't told me yet." It was a thing she asked sometimes, at intervals, as a kind of ongoing excavation of each other. The belief that there was always more, always another layer to find if you kept asking. He thought about it. "I was riding out here that first morning," he said. "To execute the eviction, I stopped about half a mile from the property. I sat on my horse for about 10 minutes looking at the ridge." "Why?" "Because something felt wrong," he said. "I couldn't have told you what exactly. Just a feeling, the kind you develop after enough years of doing this work, when your instinct knows something before your reasoning does. Something felt wrong about the assignment, about the way the papers had arrived on my desk, about the whole shape of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I almost turned back." She was looking at him. "But you didn't." "I told myself I was wrong to be suspicious, that I was inventing reasons not to do my job." He shook his head. "I should have listened to the instinct." "If you had," she said, "we would not have met." He thought about that. "No. So maybe," she said, with the dry precision that was entirely her own, "your instinct was wrong to be suspicious about the assignment, but right to keep going toward what was waiting at the end of it." He looked at her. The lamplight from inside fell across her in the window, and she was the same woman who had stood on this porch with a rifle at his chest. And she was the woman who had poured him coffee and shown him a deed he couldn't argue with. And she was the woman who had laughed against his mouth in the kitchen and said her vows without hesitation, and slept beside him for 7 years and given him 2 children, and rebuilt this homestead into a life that felt like it could hold anything. She was all of those things simultaneously, and they were all entirely and continuously her. "I love you," he said, because it was the simplest and most accurate thing. "I know," she said, the way she always did, not dismissively, but with the specificity of someone who has received this information repeatedly and continues to find it both welcome and true. Then she said, as she always did, "I love you too." The night settled around them. Eduardo's telescope was set up at the corner of the porch because his father had promised they would look at Saturn's rings before the end of summer. Rosa had left her boots on the porch steps, which was a consistent habit that Maria consistently corrected, and which Rosa consistently resumed. The garden smelled of rosemary and the dry earth sweetness of the desert, and somewhere on the ridge a coyote spoke once to the darkness and received no answer. Grant thought about the morning he had ridden up this path with an eviction notice in his pocket and the certainty that he was executing a routine assignment. He thought about the woman on the porch with her rifle and her refusal and her deed, and the deed she had shown him that was incontestable and correct, and that he had not been able to argue with for a single word. He thought that the law at its best was supposed to work the way it had worked that morning, not as an instrument of whoever had the most money to file the right paperwork, but as a thing that could be cut through to its bedrock principle, which was, what is true? What actually happened? Who actually holds the right? Maria had known what was true. She had held her ground on the truth with a rifle and a document and an absolute refusal to be moved, and she had been right, and the truth had eventually accumulated enough weight to establish itself. That was what justice looked like, he thought, when it worked. Not fast, not clean, not without cost, but true. And the other thing that had been true, hidden in the morning's confrontation and only fully revealed over the months and years that followed, was that he had ridden toward his own future without knowing it, had ridden toward the woman he was meant to build a life with, on the land she had fought for, under the Texas sky that did not negotiate with anyone. He reached over and took her hand in the dark. She was already reaching for him. 2 years later, in the spring of 1890, Maria told Grant she was expecting a third child. Eduardo was 6 and deeply engaged with the telescope, and with the primer on astronomy that Grant had sent away to San Antonio for. Rosa was 4 and had recently demonstrated the ability to unsaddle and saddle her own horse, which Grant celebrated, and which resulted in a long conversation with Samuel about the importance of double-checking Rosa's cinch straps before she rode anywhere unaccompanied. The third child came in November of 1890, another boy, who arrived with considerably more patience and ceremony than Rosa had, taking his time in a way that the midwife said she appreciated professionally. They named him William, for Grant's father, and Eduardo Garcia Archer Mercer the full name, as Maria had always insisted, who had died with a Missouri winter and had never known that his son would eventually find his way to a red-ridged corner of southwest Texas and put down roots that went to bedrock. William was a round and cheerful baby who charmed everyone in his immediate vicinity with what appeared to be a constitutional good humor that belonged entirely to himself, since neither of his parents had come by cheerfulness naturally. And Eduardo and Rosa both regarded their new brother with the particular combination of pride and mild bewilderment that older siblings bring to the sudden reality of a baby in the house. Rosa, at 4, had appointed herself William's primary protector, a role she took extremely seriously, which meant that William's infancy was conducted under the constant surveillance of a small girl who was already, in terms of personal authority, significantly beyond her years. Eduardo, at 6, explained to his new brother the names and locations of the constellations visible from the bedroom window, in a gentle and thorough monologue that William listened to with apparent interest, which Eduardo took as confirmation that his brother had good scientific instincts. Grant watched all of this from the particular vantage point of a man who has been surprised by his own happiness and has decided to pay attention to it, carefully, because attention is how you keep things. The homestead was as it had been built and expanded, and tended 200 acres of high desert ranch land with a house that had grown to accommodate its inhabitants, a kitchen garden that exceeded its original scope every summer, a small herd of cattle that Samuel managed with increasing skill, 2 horses and a mule, the telescope on the porch, Rosa's boots permanently left on the steps, and Maria's books still on the shelf by the window alongside some additions. The astronomy primer, a medical reference, several agricultural texts, and the complete works of George Eliot, which Grant had given Maria for their 5th anniversary and which she had read 3 times. Grant's badge was on the desk in what had been the storage room and was now his office. He still wore it, still rode his territory, still brought the law to the far corners of Brewster County, with the particular combination of patience and firmness that had become his professional signature. He was known in the county not for toughness, exactly, but for accuracy, for the quality of being difficult to mislead and impossible to corrupt, which were, he thought, the 2 most important qualities a lawman could have. The Mercer deed was still in its box under the bed. Maria took it out once a year. On the anniversary of the morning she had shown it to Grant on the porch, and unfolded it and read it and then folded it carefully and put it back. She did not explain this ritual, and Grant did not ask, because he understood it without explanation. The deed was the foundation, not just of the legal ownership, but of everything else. The choice she had made to stand her ground, the confrontation that had brought him to her door, the life that had been built from that impossible morning onward. The deed was where it began, and she kept it as you keep a beginning, with respect and gratitude and the occasional need to hold it in your hands and confirm that it is real. He loved her for that. Among the very many specific things he loved her for, he loved that. On the last afternoon of October in 1890, a few weeks after William came home, Grant stood at the window of his office and looked out at the homestead in the autumn light. The ridge was deep red in the late sun. The garden had been put to bed for the winter. Eduardo was somewhere on the property doing something scientific with a stick and a notebook. Rosa was in the stable having a serious conversation with her horse. Maria was at the kitchen table with William, nursing him and reading at the same time, which was a kind of multitasking that Grant had come to regard with admiration as a defining characteristic of her capacity for efficiency. He thought about what he might have said to himself if he could have sent a word back to the man on the horse that April morning in 1882, the man riding toward a routine assignment with an eviction notice in his pocket and no idea what was waiting for him at the end of the path. He would have said, "Go, keep going. The woman on the porch is holding a rifle and she is right to hold it, and the deed she has is real, and you cannot argue with a word of it. And you shouldn't want to. Because the law, when it is what it ought to be, is not a mechanism for taking things from people who rightfully hold them. It is the thing that stands between them and loss. Go, do your job honestly, look at what is true, and stay when the staying is the true thing." That was all. That was everything. He went back to the kitchen table and sat down next to his wife and his youngest child, and Maria looked up from her book and shifted William slightly and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. He poured himself coffee and opened his own reading and settled into the afternoon, warm and present, in the house on the 200 acres that belonged legally, inarguably, completely, to the woman beside him. Outside, the wind moved across the desert the way it always had, patient and indifferent and ongoing. The red ridge held the last of the light. The first stars were beginning to come out, and somewhere in the gathering dark Eduardo's voice floated back from the yard, naming them. Rosa came in from the stable, left her boots on the porch steps, and announced that her horse had an opinion about the cold weather that she agreed with. William made a sound of contentment. Maria turned a page. Grant held his coffee and looked at the room, this house, this life built on ground that no one was taking, and felt, as he always felt in these moments, the specific and daily weight of what it meant to have been given a second chance at the thing you thought you had lost for good. Not luck, not fate. Just a morning when he had looked at the truth instead of the paperwork. Just a woman who had refused to be moved. Just a deed that was incontestable. Just that and everything that had grown from it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly everything.